On Christmas Eve, 1945, in a little two-story house at the edge of Fayetteville, West Virginia, 10 people went to sleep and only 5 came back out. Sometime after midnight, the Sodder family home caught fire. Within minutes, it was a wall of flame you could see from the road. The parents escaped. 4 of their children escaped. The other 5, who'd gone back upstairs to bed after opening their presents, were never seen again. No bodies in the rubble, no bones anyone could prove were theirs, just ashes, questions, and a family who refused to believe their children had died in that fire. Most people, if they've heard of the Sodder case at all, think of it as a weird old Christmas mystery with a spooky billboard. But if you zoom in, it feels much more like a slow-motion horror story. Strange warnings before the fire, cut phone lines, a ladder that suddenly wasn't where it should have been, a truck that wouldn't start when every second counted. Then, in the years afterward, rumors of the children being seen alive at a motel, in a photograph, in a crowd. The official story said they died in the blaze. The Sodders spent the rest of their lives acting as if the fire was only the beginning. So put your headphones on and imagine you've just finished a long Christmas Eve. The kids are finally in bed, wrapping paper piled up in the corner. The house smells like pine, wood smoke, and the kind of rich food that only ever gets cooked on holidays. Outside it's cold and quiet, just a dark line of trees and the occasional car on the road. You turn off the lights, trusting the walls around you to keep your family safe until morning. That's where we start. In a house full of sleeping children, with a fire already quietly getting ready to rewrite everything. In 1945, the Sodder family were exactly the kind of people small towns are built on, loud, hard-working, and impossible to ignore. George and Jenny were Italian immigrants who'd carved out a life in West Virginia, hauling coal and raising kids. And there were a lot of kids. By that Christmas, they had 10 children ranging from grown and out of the house to still small enough to be carried up the stairs. The big white frame house they lived in sat near the highway, a little removed from the center of Fayetteville, with a small office attached for George's trucking business. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid. 2 stories, a sturdy staircase, and bedrooms crowded with beds and the kind of chaos that comes with that many siblings. The Sodders weren't quiet about their opinions, especially George. He'd built a good living with his trucking company and had strong feelings about politics, particularly about Mussolini and the fascists back in Italy. He didn't like them at all. He argued about it in barbershops, at the office, anywhere someone mentioned the old country. Those conversations might seem far away from a house fire on Christmas Eve, but later, when the family tried to make sense of what happened, they kept circling back to them. People remember who you argue with, especially in a small town where grudges can live a long time. Inside the Sodder home that December, though, the atmosphere was all holiday. The war had just ended. The older boys were either home or on their way. There was a Christmas tree set up with lights and tinsel, and presents already opened earlier in the evening. The younger kids, Maurice, Martha, Louise, Jenny, and little Betty, had begged to stay up late. Their older sister Marion had brought them candy from the dime store where she worked, and the sugar had them bright-eyed long past their usual bedtime. It was the kind of warm, chaotic, happy night that looks like safety when you're inside it. Jenny finally called time on the party. Around 10 p.m., she and George headed upstairs to bed in their room, taking the youngest little boy with them. The older kids moved around the house on their own routines, some heading to their rooms, some lingering by the tree. A couple of the older boys stayed up, still buzzing from the day. Jenny checked that the doors were locked, that the curtains were drawn, that the lights were out except for the glow of the tree. She noticed that one of the downstairs doors wasn't locked the way she liked, and that a few of the kids hadn't closed the curtains. She fixed those details with the automatic movements of someone who's done it 1,000 times, and then let the day finally catch up with her. Sometime around 12:30 a.m., Jenny was jolted awake by the sound of the phone ringing. In a house that full, even normal noises tend to feel urgent after midnight. She got out of bed and went downstairs to answer it, the floorboards cold under her feet. On the line was a woman whose voice Jenny didn't recognize, asking for someone Jenny didn't know. There was laughter in the background, clinking glasses, the noise of some distant party that had nothing to do with the quiet house in West Virginia. Jenny told the caller she had the wrong number. The woman laughed strangely, repeated the wrong name again, and finally hung up. It was a small, odd moment, one Jenny might have forgotten if the night had gone differently. As she set the phone back in its cradle, Jenny noticed something else. The house wasn't quite how she'd left it. The lights were still on downstairs, the curtains weren't closed after all. The front door was unlocked. She saw that some of the kids weren't where she expected them to be. Marion was asleep on the couch, but the younger ones who'd begged to stay up were nowhere in the living room. Jenny assumed they'd gone up to the attic-style bedroom where several of the children slept, and that the older kids had forgotten to shut things down properly. She turned off the lights, locked the door, pulled the curtains, and went back to bed. Before she fell fully asleep again, Jenny heard another sound, this one outside. It was a heavy, dull thump on the roof, followed by what she later described as a kind of rolling noise, as if something had bounced and slid down the slope of the house. Then silence. No breaking glass, no shouting, no second impact. In the moment, in that groggy middle place between dreaming and waking, it was easy to file the noise under weird but not urgent. The house had been there for years. Roofs creak, branches fall, rocks sometimes bounce down the hill from the highway. She let the sound drift away and finally closed her eyes. The next time Jenny woke up, it wasn't to something small. It was to the smell of smoke and a faint crackling sound that did not belong in a sleeping house. Her eyes opened to a strange glow outside the bedroom door, the wrong kind of light for the middle of the night. Heart pounding, she got up and stepped into the hallway, expecting maybe a minor problem, a knocked-over candle, a log rolled too far out of the fireplace. What she saw instead was thick, choking smoke drifting up the stairway, and the faint flicker of flames already chewing their way through the lower part of the house. The night that had started with candy and Christmas lights was now suddenly, brutally on fire. Fire doesn't move politely through a house. It hunts shortcuts. By the time Jenny saw the glow, flames were already racing up the stairwell near George's office and the main hallway. Heat wrapped around the lower walls like a living thing. She shouted for the children and for George, her voice already ragged from the smoke. In seconds, the quiet Christmas Eve house turned into chaos, bare feet hitting the floor, coughing, confused cries as people scrambled in the dark toward whatever exit they could see. The first priority was simple and brutal. Get whoever was in reach out now. Jenny grabbed the youngest child from the bedroom and pushed toward the front door while some of the older kids stumbled out of their rooms and down the stairs. The flames had already cut off the main route to the attic bedroom where 5 of the children slept. The staircase was a wall of heat and light, impossible to pass. In the confusion, people assumed others were making it downstairs. When the first cluster of bodies spilled out onto the cold lawn and the front yard, barefoot and half-dressed, everyone did a quick mental head count that came up wrong. Out in the freezing night air with the house glowing hot behind them, the reality hit like a second blow. 5 children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were not outside. They were supposed to be upstairs in the attic, above a part of the house that was now roaring. George reacted the way a father in that situation does, not rationally, but with pure, desperate instinct. He ran around to the side of the house where a ladder always leaned against the wall, ready for odd jobs. The plan was clear in his mind: grab the ladder, put it up to the attic window, and pull his children out one by one. Except the ladder wasn't there. The spot where it always stood, day after day, was empty. In the smoke-dimmed light, George stared at a blank patch of wall and dirt, brain struggling to process this one extra wrong thing. He sprinted to the nearby shed to move one of his coal trucks underneath the window instead, planning to climb onto the cab like a makeshift ladder. The first truck wouldn't start. The second wouldn't either. These were vehicles that had been running fine days before, now suddenly dead metal while the fire climbed higher. Two critical tools, ladder and trucks, were gone or useless at the exact moment he needed them most. Inside, the heat had grown monstrous. Flames punched through windows, sending glass and sparks raining down outside. Jenny and the older children screamed the younger kids' names into the night, listening desperately for any answer over the roar of the fire. There was none. With every passing second, the path between "we can still rescue them" and "they're gone" closed a little more. George, frantic, tried to climb the side of the house by hand, burning his arms on hot siding and falling back into the yard, fingers scraped raw. He had the terrible, dawning realization that he could not physically get to that upstairs room in time. They tried the phone next, because that's what you do when your world is burning. You call someone whose job it is to fix it. Jenny reached for the receiver and found nothing. The line was dead. Unbeknownst to them, their telephone line had been severed out at the pole, later found to be cut rather than melted by the fire. A neighbour ran to a nearby tavern to use the phone there, but the operator couldn't be reached easily, and the message took time to get through. Another neighbour drove to find the fire chief in person. By the time the volunteer fire department managed to mobilise, all they could really do was show up and look at a smoking foundation. The Sodder house burned with horrifying speed, collapsing into itself in less than an hour. What had been walls and floors full of furniture, photographs and beds became a heap of glowing ash and charred beams, sending up sparks into the winter sky. The family huddled in the yard, half frozen and in shock, watching the place that held every memory they owned turn into a blackened rectangle. At first, Jenny and George clung to a thin hope. Maybe the 5 missing kids had escaped on their own, run to a neighbour's house, gotten turned around in the dark, and would appear any minute. As the minutes stretched into dawn, that hope twisted into something else, into the sick, hollow awareness that if they weren't here, then where were they? When the fire finally burned itself down to smouldering ruins, the theory everyone tried to accept was the simplest, ugliest one. The 5 children had died in the fire, their bodies consumed by the heat. But even in her grief, Jenny couldn't make herself believe it. She'd read stories about fires and knew that bones, teeth, some trace of the body almost always remained, even in hotter blazes than this. She couldn't shake the feeling that if her children had died right there should be something in the ashes to prove it. Days later, when the official search of the ruins turned up almost nothing, that uneasy feeling hardened into conviction. The fire had taken their house, but had it really taken their children? In the first shock-blurred days after the fire, the Sodders did what grieving parents are supposed to do. They believed the adults in uniforms. The volunteer fire department and the local coroner's jury told them the same thing, that the blaze had been hot enough and burned long enough to completely consume 5 small bodies. Death certificates were issued within a week, listing the cause as fire or suffocation. Jenny listened, nodded, and tried to make her brain accept a world where her 5 children had died just a few yards away from where she was standing. On the surface, the story made sense. Underneath, something in her refused to settle. Part of it was the rubble itself. When the ash cooled enough to sift through, they found recognizable appliances, pieces of the tin roof, and other household debris that hadn't melted into nothing. In other house fires Jenny read about, even when the deaths were total, searchers still found bones and teeth, some hard, stubborn proof that a body had been there. Here, if you believed the official line, 5 children had been reduced so completely that nothing remained. It didn't sit right with her. She began burning small piles of animal bones in the stove, trying to see if they would ever vanish entirely. They never did. When she later called a crematorium, an employee told her that even at 2,000 degrees after 2 hours, human bones still survive. The Sodder fire had burned for about 45 minutes. Then there were the little practical things that kept poking holes in the just a tragic accident story. A telephone repairman told them the line to the house hadn't burned through. It had been cut by someone willing to climb up the pole and slice it a couple of feet away from the wood. The missing ladder turned up days later at the bottom of an embankment 75 feet from the house, as if someone had dragged or tossed it there before the fire. The water barrel they might have used to fight the flames was found frozen solid. And those 2 coal trucks that had run just fine the day before, whether it was sabotage or the engines getting flooded in panic, they both mysteriously refused to start when George needed them most. Once they started looking backward, other things from the weeks before the fire took on new shapes. There'd been an insurance salesman who came to the house, angry that George had refused a policy, who allegedly told him his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed because of the things he said against Mussolini. There'd been a stranger who showed up asking for work, then stood in the yard staring at the fuse box and muttering that it would cause a fire someday, even though the wiring had recently been inspected and pronounced safe. One of the older boys remembered a car that sometimes parked on the road near the house, a man inside, just watching the younger Sodder children as they walked home from school. At the time, all of that was background noise. After the fire, it sounded more like a prelude. There were strange details on the night itself, too, once people in town started comparing stories. A man had been seen near the property stealing a block and tackle from George's garage. When questioned later, he admitted cutting a line, saying he thought it was the power, not the phone, but denied knowing anything about the fire. A bus driver reported seeing what looked like balls of fire being thrown at the Sodder house late that night as he passed on the road. Months later, when the snow melted, little Sylvia found a dark green rubbery object in the brush, about the size and shape of a small pineapple. To George, who'd seen things in the war, it looked uncomfortably like an incendiary grenade, the kind that hits a roof with a thump and then rolls. Suddenly, that noise Jenny had heard before the flames, the bang on the roof and the rolling, didn't sound like a random branch anymore. Piece by piece, the neat official picture of faulty wiring and a tragic fire started to come apart in their hands. The lights in the house had stayed on while the lower floor burned, which didn't line up cleanly with an electrical fault. The cut phone line, the moved ladder, the dead trucks, the possible firebomb on the roof, each one on its own could be bad luck, coincidence, or the kind of mistake people make when they're scared. All of them together started to feel like something else. By the time winter loosened its grip on the little memorial garden they'd planted over the bulldozed remains, George and Jenny were living with a new, more terrible thought. Not just that their children might not have died in that fire, but that someone might have taken them and used the fire as smoke to cover their escape. In the months after the fire, the Sodders tried to live the version of the story everyone told them, that their children had died in the blaze and were gone. They planted flowers over the burned foundation, turning the blackened rectangle into a small memorial garden. But grief that doesn't match the facts has a way of curdling into something else. Jenny couldn't stop replaying that night. How quickly the house fell, how little was found, how many things went wrong at exactly the worst time. Eventually, the quiet suspicion she carried turned into a decision. They were going to investigate the fire themselves, even if that meant admitting the worst possibility, that something deliberate had happened to their family. In 1949, 4 years after the fire, they convinced a pathologist to help them dig into the site where the children's bedroom had been, literally. The yard was excavated, the ashes turned over again, this time with more care than the rushed post-fire search. Amidst the soil and debris, they found a few small fragments of bone, vertebrae from a spine, and sent them to an expert for analysis. The verdict made everything weirder, not clearer. The bones likely came from a young man in his late teens or early 20s, and there was no sign they'd ever been exposed to the kind of heat that would have burned down the house. The pieces almost certainly did not belong to any of the missing Sodder children. That result snapped the last thin thread holding the they just burned up theory together for the parents. If the fire hadn't destroyed every trace of a body, and the only bones they found probably belonged to someone else entirely, maybe even from filled dirt brought in during construction, then what were they supposed to believe? For George and Jenny, the answer was simple and terrifying. The children had been removed from the house before or during the fire. From that point on, they stopped talking about their kids in the past tense. Publicly and privately, they behaved as if Morris, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty were still alive somewhere. That meant looking for them, and looking meant turning their private horror into a public campaign. The Sodders printed posters and handbills with the children's photos and details, sending them all over the country. George drove thousands of miles following up tips, a girl in a convent here, a boy in a work camp there, a set of siblings seen with unfamiliar adults at a motel. Some leads were vague, almost certainly cases of people wanting to help but misremembering a face. Others were specific enough to make the long drives worth it, and then, inevitably, ended in dead ends. Every not them chipped away at their hope in one way and strengthened their stubbornness in another. In 1952, they did something no one in town could ignore. They put up a giant billboard on Route 16, right near the site of the old house. On it were the children's portraits, the date of the fire, and a blunt question about what had happened. Over the years, the board would be updated with an offer of a reward for information and a summary of the more suspicious details: the cut phone line, the threatening stranger, the moved ladder. Drivers passing through Fayetteville couldn't miss it. For locals, it became part of the landscape, a reminder you saw every time you went into town that here, on this ground, was a family that refused to accept the tidy version of its own tragedy. Leads continued to trickle in, some heartbreakingly specific. A woman claimed she'd checked in a few days after Christmas to a Charleston hotel where she saw 2 Italian-looking men with several children. She remembered one girl watching silently while the men spoke sharply in another language, and only years later, after seeing the Sodder photos, became convinced that girl was one of the missing daughters. Another person swore they'd seen a photograph of a New York schoolgirl who looked exactly like Betty. Each story arrived like a spark, enough to flare hope back to life for a moment, but none came with the kind of proof you can build a reunion on. The strangest clue of all came in 1967, more than 2 decades after the fire. Jenny received an envelope in the mail, postmarked from Kentucky with no return address. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his 20s. On the back, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie, Elil boys, A9132 or 35. Louis had been 9 when the house burned. The face in the photo did look like him grown up. Similar eyes, similar jaw. The family blew the picture up, put it side by side with old photos, and convinced themselves the resemblance wasn't just wishful thinking. They hired a private investigator to go to Kentucky and try to track down whoever had sent the letter. He took the photo, promised to report back, and never did. To this day, no one knows what happened to him, or whether the picture was a sick joke, a mistake, or the closest thing to a real glimpse of one of the missing Sodder children living under another name. Jenny framed the photo and hung it in her home. Every day, she walked past the face of a man who might have been her son and was forced to live inside a question mark. Over time, the fire itself blurred at the edges. Official records never changed. The 5 children were listed as dead, their deaths attributed to the blaze. Unofficially, the story split into camps. Some believed the simplest explanation, that the combination of heat, construction, and a rushed investigation had just masked a horrible truth. Others pointed at the cut line, the threats about Mussolini, the strange phone call, and saw conspiracy. Maybe the children had been taken by someone with a personal or political grudge, then trafficked or placed into other families. The idea of organized crime or an adoption ring got folded into the legend, even though there was never concrete proof. George kept searching until his health failed. He died in 1969 with no solid answer about what had happened to his kids. Jenny wore black for the rest of her life, a visual protest that never faded, and kept the house site as a garden and later a home they built nearby filled with clippings, letters, and the ever-present billboard image in smaller frames. The younger children who'd survived that night grew up under the weight of a story that never resolved. Sylvia, the baby on Jenny's hip during the fire, became one of the loudest voices keeping the case alive, repeating what she remembered and what her parents had told her. As the decades rolled on, the case moved from fresh wound to folklore. Articles labeled it one of America's strangest Christmas mysteries. Amateur sleuths wrote long posts laying out timelines, comparing old photos, debating whether 5 children could really leave no trace in that fire. Skeptics pointed out flaws in the family's reasoning, suggesting grief and guilt had built a more elaborate story on top of a simple, awful accident. Believers countered with the same stubborn list of things that don't quite fit: the cut line, the ladder, the trucks, the explosion sound, the empty ash. The Sodder children remained suspended somewhere between these 2 versions of history. Today the house is long gone and the original billboard has been taken down, but the question it asked is still hanging in the air over Route 16. Did 5 children die in that fire, lost to a combination of bad wiring, bad luck, and a chaotic volunteer response? Or did someone use that fire as cover to take them, leaving behind a family who spent the rest of their lives chasing ghosts and rumors? There's no answer that feels clean. Either way, the horror is the same. Parents standing in a yard on Christmas morning, staring at a burned-out shell of a home and realizing that the most important part of their world is missing in a way no one can prove. Because that's the part of the Sodder story that lingers long after you close the case file. It isn't just the fire or the clues or even the mysterious photograph from Kentucky. It's the idea of waking up in the safest place you know, your own home, on a night full of presents and family, and realizing that the walls around you can't guarantee anything, that 5 little beds can be empty forever without a body to bury or a story you can point to and say, "This is what happened." The Sodder Children case lives in that gap where grief and uncertainty blur together, and where the line between tragedy and something else never quite stops flickering. If you're still here with your headphones on, thank you for sitting with the Sodder family's story all the way to the end. On the surface, it's a house fire on a cold Christmas Eve, but once you peel back the ashes, it turns into something else. Cut phone lines, missing ladders, dead trucks, bones that don't match, and parents who spent the rest of their lives acting like their kids were still out there somewhere. No bodies, no confessions, just a billboard by the road and a haunting question. Did the fire kill 5 children, or did it cover up something worse? If this episode made you picture that house in the dark, tree lights off, kids asleep upstairs, and a dull thump on the roof that nobody understood until it was too late, do me a favor and hit the like button so more people stumble into this story. And if you want more long, slow-burn horror history like this, mystery fires, ghost ships, vanished hikers, and cases that never quite sit right, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think happened to the Sodder children? Did they die in that fire and grief built a legend on top of it? Or do you think someone really took them? And if so, why? Drop your theory in the comments. I'll be reading them in the dark, probably staring too long at that photograph of the man who might have been Louis. And if you're using this to fall asleep, I hope the only flicker you see tonight is from a candle or a screen, not from the corner of your room where the wall seems a little too bright. Sleep well, and if you wake up to a strange noise on the roof, maybe take a second to look twice.